So there's something about burial rituals going back to Neanderthals that seems to be important to people. Yeah.
I was going to say it's almost like an invasion. The people that are alive can see how the society and the penal structure can invade our world in their life. But once they're dead, it's like the line can't be crossed. Like, you now have lost your control over me once I'm dead. But to see the state then intervene after they're dead too, that you're never free of that.
And that freedom's important. There's actually a dramatic scene. We didn't talk about it, but one of the other moments of the execution ritual that people actually would gather for, and sometimes especially the friends and relatives of the convict about to be executed, they would come out of the jail. If you visited any of these tourist traps in London, they turn to these old jails and sort of museums of torture. They throw everything in there, whether it has anything to do with the historical period they're talking about or not. You'll get stretching racks and whatnot. Even English never use that. But one thing you will see that is accurate in a lot of these places, they'll have what's called the striking stone. There'll be a stone right at the threshold of the jail door where, when you came into the jail, your manacles would be pounded onto you, and when you left the jail, they would be struck off of you. And it was a very symbolic moment when the capital convict would have their manacles struck off, symbolizing the fact that they were free in a certain sense, even though they now had to pay with their life. But I think you're touching. I think this is very helpful, right? I mean, notice two things. One, death is not that big a deal in this world. People die all the time. People die young all the time. People die of all kinds of diseases that you and I wouldn't think twice about. People die in childbirth all the time. Take a walk in any 19th century, let alone 18th century graveyard, and you'll see countless mothers whose death day is the same as their child's birthday because they died in childbirth. So the fact that death is taking our loved ones from us in arbitrary, capricious ways at times that we're not expecting, etc., is something that people learn to deal with in a certain level. And I think you're right that in that world we're given certain comforts, like the right to a burial, in which we can have a kind of reunion with our loved one, in which we can mourn together, etc. And when the state begins to threaten that, right, it actually moves into, ironically, even more emotional territory. There were more practical reasons too. We know that part of the execution lore was that, and we know that in fact hanging wasn't a perfect system. So sometimes people weren't quite dead when they were quite cut down, which meant that there was always the hope that a quick dram or two of whiskey, in the local tavern would sort of revive you. Whereas if you end up, on the surgeon's table, that wasn't going to happen. They were, I'm not dead yet. Oh, yes, you are. So you definitely, if you had any chance of being rescued, of surviving, you didn't want to end up on the surgeon. There was certainly the notion of resurrection, right? I mean, this is the reason that traditional very Orthodox Jews don't want any part of their body to be burned or separated from them, because you want your whole body there on Resurrection Day when the Lord calls us up from our graves and makes us whole again. Well, that was helpful and important to people who are deeply religious. So I think there are reasons why the surgery became such a big deal. And notice what a nice, two-sided tool this is. On the one hand, it allows the judges and the elites to kind of precisely edge up the punishment with a mercy even beyond the death decision, right? So you're going to deny somebody their pardon or their clemency, but you might remit and allow them not to be dissected, right? And that would be a way of lessening the blow of having to hang, etc. Or to really terrorize or to add ignominy and additional insult to injury, you let the dissection go forward. It's also fascinating, of course, that British medical science came to depend on the supply of executed bodies. And it was very interesting being in Edinburgh last year, which was one of the world centers of surgery in this period and one of the world centers of hanging. And clearly there was a kind of economy between these two. And I just want to note here, because we're going to see again, certainly when we study prisons, that whenever we create a form of punishment, it becomes embedded in various kinds of political and economic exchange relations that have their own independent force, right? The surgeons didn't design this execution system, but when it came into being, they recognized a vital source of something that was otherwise essentially unavailable other than by stealing bodies from cemeteries, which people did. And as we'll see when we study the prison today, there's a lot of economic interests that have come to depend on prisons for their profits and for their wages, etc. And we sometimes talk about a prison industrial complex today. And it's almost tempting to look at this article by Peter Linebaugh and say that they had something of a dissection industrial complex, where they were sort of executing people for the market. People have questioned whether China uses death penalty to produce organs for the transplant market. So there can be markets that form around systems of punishment. Pay close attention to them. I generally take at least the working hypothesis that these economic interests rarely by themselves bring a form of punishment into being, but they can become important sources of endurance, resistance to reform and change, because people get used to benefits that they're getting from this system. So again, we don't know whether there were a lot of riots, because there's nothing to compare it to. We can't really say that there's no clear evidence that the amount of riots was getting worse, and it's difficult to know what to make of these. Clearly, they indicated that people resisted, that people weren't totally dominated by the ideological power of these events. Whether they played a significant role in bringing about an end to the public execution ritual is harder to say. Let's talk a little bit about that end. In 1783, so right in the middle of this period where executions continued to be used and continued to go up for some time after this, but in 1783, the two London has more than one sheriff, so two new sheriffs that had been put into power in that year worked together to make a decision to move the execution site from Tyburn, which had been about a 2.5 to 3 mile trip from the jail, and this cause of that pub crawl through London, to the jail itself. And this is the new structure that they build. Here's an image of it in use. As you can see, they're still maintaining the basic publicness and outdoorness of the execution, but it's in a much more fortified setting. Instead of having to ride through London and execute somebody in the middle of this giant sort of field filled with drunken people, you're doing it right outside the jail, where the sheriff's men can mobilize quickly. You can bring prisoners out from the jail without having to take them through the crowd. So it's already clearly a much more controlled scene. Did they move it here because they were afraid of rioting? We don't know for sure. When we look at this structure, it's hard not to imagine that wasn't on their mind, right? This is a more defensible structure. There's no need to take the people through the city anymore. At the same time, the two sheriffs were both evangelical Christians, which was kind of a new religious revival movement at that time. And part of they may have done this out of some religious sense, that the events at Tyburn were scandalous in their kind of festival-like aspect, that this would provide a more dignified, more somber and sober. Nonetheless, there is a process here of a dramatic change in the bloodiness and really the very nature of capital punishment in this period. After a long, continued use of this ritual, despite all the criticisms and all the problems pointed out, you begin to get a pattern of change, which I'm going to briefly review, beginning in about 1830. So from 1688, the beginning of the Hanover on, during this whole rise of commercial capitalism in England, we get tremendous growth in capital crimes, no diminution or even increase in the actual use of executions, notwithstanding the fact that all these criticisms are pretty well stated and reformers are arguing for change. But change comes. In 1832, between 1832 and 1841, most of the capital crimes are eliminated, and you basically get down to a handful of the most violent felonies: burglary attended by violence, robbery with wounding, piracy, as well as murder. By 1867, just 30 years later, it'll only be murder and treason that are capital crimes, right? So they, in a fairly rapid period, they go from the full festival we've been looking at, where they execute people in public for all kinds of relatively minor property crimes, to a system where they only execute people for murder and occasionally treason, which is more or less our system still to this day, and was in England until the 1960s. But they also move it inside. In 1860, they moved the gallows from the outside of Newgate Prison inside the prison. So now execution will take place completely without that public event. There'll be no longer, there's some opportunities like a religious sermon, etc., for some contact, but the festival-like ritual is over. Well, what do we make of this? Let me spend the last few minutes beginning our talk about essentially this dramatic partial abolition of the death penalty, which really makes it a different kind of a penalty. It moves from being the kind of general, main course punishment for serious crime to being an exceptional punishment for the worst crime. And of course, it moves a lot of the moral weight of gravity away from crimes like burglary and theft, where the sympathy might be with the audience might be with the criminal, to murder, where almost nobody's supporting the prisoner, right? And this is obviously a big change in the moral sturdiness and stability of capital punishment. So what accounts for this change? Were the authorities afraid that if they continued to execute people, at least in this outdoor, painful, and vested way, that they would run into greater and greater numbers of rebellions and riots? That's not so clear. I think what we can say is that, and what I want to do in the last few minutes is talk about some of the ways that the English ruling class found itself less committed to capital punishment, less dependent on capital punishment. And then next week, we'll begin to talk about the rise of some new ways of thinking and new ideologies that began to push at least some members of the ruling elite into active opposition to the death penalty, especially religious communities that became abolitionists. So let's talk a little bit about why the noose and the scaffold became a little less valuable and easier to give up. One reason is that despite not having wanted a French-style police force, by the 1830s, London had a police force, a metropolitan police force. It was a police force that would be distinctively British. I can't really teach you much about it now. See, if I ever teach a course on policing, I would look at it in more detail. There's some important differences from the French police. But the main thing is you've got essentially a professional police force in London by the 1830s. By the 1860s, this will spread to most large English and Scottish cities. And the rise of this police force does a number of things. For one thing, it assures a much steadier flow of property criminals into jail. Right? Up until the 1830s, the chance of actually getting caught for any of these crimes is very, very, very low. Suddenly, with the rise of the metropolitan police and various kinds of informant networks that they are able to create, you're starting to effectively arrest a lot of people. You're also getting the beginnings of a public prosecution. It's not a full governmentalization of prosecution, but there's getting to be, by the 1830s and 40s, and certainly by the 1860s, there are prosecution associations, which essentially are funded by wealthier people to help ordinary people bring prosecutions. Police officers become quasi-prosecutors and give advice to witnesses, and victims. So you're getting a much more effective justice system. Now, this does two things. On the one hand, it makes the whole system feel more confident about itself, right? If you have a police force that's actually arresting lots of criminals, you feel less anxiety about the risk that you face from the potentially angry and impoverished population around you. But it also meant that there were more and more people facing capital sentences. So that whole pardoning machinery was starting to run overdrive because they didn't want to execute scores of people where they would have just executed dozens before. They wanted to keep a pretty even keel. And so in order to eliminate people from this, they were having to work harder and harder. And the people who were left to swing were often felt very poorly served because they were convicted of many of the same kinds of crimes. So I think there was real pressure, in a sense, to downscale the system because it was almost too successful. It was producing too many candidates. And while they may have wanted some of that opportunity for public arousal, they didn't necessarily want to have that happen all the time, especially in a society that was trying to become more disciplined, industrial, commercial. The second factor I think that's very important here is the movement away from monarchy. England obviously still has a monarch. Queen Victoria, who rules through most of the night, from 1850 to about 1897, is still a very powerful monarch who has a lot of influence, etc. But by the time you get to the 1830s, Britain is basically ruled by a party system in which the monarch is more or less a constitutional captive of the ruling party. The parties are far from democratic, small d, in our sense. The suffrage and voting rights in England are very restricted. There's no attempt to align members of parliament with population equivalent units, so there's terrible inequality. So it's not really a democratic system, but it is a political system. And many of the things that I was arguing last time, drawing on Foucault, made the public execution very helpful to building up that very peculiar kind of power associated with monarchy. That same kind of very heated, kind of penal heat-oriented royal form of power was really increasingly not, it did not fit well with a party political system that, as you can imagine, is a somewhat more rational, bureaucratic kind of a system that depends more on networks of exchange and favor giving and taking than it does on these kind of semi-mystical rituals of building up kind of awe and terror and personal loyalty to the king. Although the king remains a very important figure. And it's also the case, and this is the last slide I'll show you, that as we look at the long sweep of European history, overall levels of violence are going down. I mean, we may think of the period we've been talking about, and you can see that there is kind of a surge of violence in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But compared to essentially the late Middle Ages, the 18th century even is a piece of cake in terms of violence. So you've got an overall trend of violence down. And that may be one of the things that makes the ruling classes feel, one, that they don't need to use lethal violence in this highly stylized, extravagant way so much to govern a population that's becoming more docile, but also that it's less acceptable, right? That a public that's sort of used to lots of lethal violence around them is now maybe more likely to be appalled and shocked by what they see on the scaffold than sort of reassured and cheered by it. And here's just a picture of American crime rates from 1830 through 1930. And you can see that here, too, there's a significant downturn, at least until you get to the crime problems of the 20th century. Okay, have a great weekend. Look for our memo on papers sometime next week, and we'll see you here on Tuesday.